Good afternoon, everyone. It's been a pleasure to stand in front of you today. I just want to say thank you very much once again, and I'll go ahead and begin this topic. Best practices in deck construction. What does that actually mean? Many of us go to properties during our inspections, and what we see is a deck that's been on the house. We'll just make up a number, X number of years, right? What we don't understand is oftentimes how well is that deck maintained, and how well was it built in terms of the construction techniques, the materials, the fasteners, and more importantly, the flashing. As I dig deeper into this, I'm going to show you some technical construction details as well as what can happen when the right components and right pieces aren't put together in the proper manner. All right, today, what I want to focus on and help you do is build your knowledge of the deck components. I want to help you identify deck construction issues. And then lastly, I'm going to challenge each of you in terms of the methods and practice that you apply to deck inspection. And why is this important? Because oftentimes I'm just speculating. If you're spending 45 minutes to do the whole exterior of the house, in that 45 minutes, you may have allocated, quote unquote, 10 to 15 minutes at a max to look at the deck. Unless you really understand all the technical details, you will not be able to inspect that deck in that time period. So with that challenge, let's dig into the details and see where we can take this. First of all, I want you to know a lot of my context today will be driven from the current Virginia Uniform Building Code. And you're going to say, oh, we're not allowed to quote code. We're not quoting code. What I want you to do is have a knowledge base for where the information comes from, and also why it's important as you begin this deck inspection that you'll probably spend 10 minutes to 15 minutes on, and I'm challenging you to think differently about that. So, as a fact, on January 18th, 2024, the Virginia Uniform Building Code was updated to the 2021 IRC code. So I wanted you to have that reference point. How long ago was that? About 14 months. Next, if you're familiar with the code and you want to dig deeper in terms of your knowledge base, here is the code section of the IRC for you to look up. It's section R501. And in that section, it talks about exterior decks. So again, wanting to give you the basis for where we're going to go and why this is so important. One other thing that I want to point out before I go to the next slide is simply, there's only 2 times during the home inspection where you're going to see the actual complete structure of a component. You're going to see it during pre-drywall if you do that type of inspection, and during a deck inspection. That's it. At no other point will you see the actual structure of that house. You'll see a piece of the attic and roof structure during the attic inspection. But again, those are the 3 places, and I would call it 2.5 places where you have the potential to see the structure. The next is the typical deck detail for most counties is available online. For Fairfax County, given that's where we're located today, their information is the typical deck detail from 2021. Why is that important? I want you to know, regardless of the location that you operate out of or where most of your clients are, you can go to that county's website and find their typical deck detail such that you have that as a resource and a basis for you to go inspect properties that have decks in that jurisdiction. All right. I'm going to get into some statistics, and the first is from the Forest Products Journal. It indicates that the use life of pressure treated lumber is approximately 9 years. As a counterpart, the National Association of Home Builders says it's approximately 20 years. So what does that really mean? As Mike pointed out, there's more than 30 million decks that are past their use life, either between 9 and 20 years. So that should raise your attention to, I need to pay attention to this deck. Unless you could physically give an estimate that that deck has been built in the last, 1 to 7 years, you'll need to pay attention to that deck in more detail because it's potentially at its use life. What does it mean when a deck is beyond its use life? Whoops. It can actually collapse. This picture of the deck that's collapsed is from Virginia Beach. Let's learn a little bit about why the decks can actually collapse. The first one at the top, and I'm going to point, and I'll use my cool pointer right here. This deck here at the top, we'll call this the 11 o'clock position from a clock. This is from Fairfax County. This deck collapsed, and a week later, I got a call from a homeowner that is diagonally down the street from this house and wanted their deck inspected. The homeowner's daughter broke her leg as a result of this deck collapse. The next picture on the 1 o'clock position is a deck that collapsed in Maryland. The 7 o'clock position, that is also a Maryland deck collapse. And you can see the first responders are still on site managing to someone that's laying on the ground. And that is right in there. The 5 o'clock position picture is another deck collapse in Maryland. And what I want you to see in all of these positions, and I'm going to highlight right now. If you look at the siding, right there where the ledger board is, right there where the ledger board was, right there where the ledger board was, and you wouldn't believe it, right where the ledger board is. Okay? So this is why I want you to have a different focus on decks when you're going to inspect them as they reach that upper range of approximately 9 to 20 years. Okay? Next is, let's dig a little bit deeper. And this is from Robeson Forensics. So they go out and do analysis for insurance companies to determine the cause of a quote unquote structural issue. In this case, their study was on deck collapses. And these are the highlights that they concluded were the primary causes based on their forensic analysis. What I wanted to point out is 3 primary items and then the 4th one. I'll use my cursor, the highlight, rotten wood. Let's pause for a second. Based on the previous 4 pictures we looked at, we saw deteriorated wood at the ledger board, rotten wood, and the deck collapsed. The next item with the orange arrow is poor design and construction. I'm going to help you understand the construction detail in just a moment. By the way, lack of inspection and maintenance. As you're on site, it's your job to understand what's going on with that deck as you are all the other components of the house. So that awareness on how to apply this knowledge to that deck is going to be very important, such that you're not one of the forensic outcomes on a list that said lack of inspection. The final item exceeding capacity is putting too many people on a deck. Most decks, I'm just going to say it, are not built with a building permit, nor are they inspected. As part of that inspection process, they could have determined that, let's say, the joists or the ledger board, for example, were too small for the size and span of different components on that deck. As a result, the load-bearing capacity of that deck that was thought to be, we'll just make up a simple number, X number of people live load versus the dead load of the actual weight of the structure. And then if you had snow or other conditions on that deck, what would that load capacity be? They may be exceeding that because they're not using the right components and they save money and use, let's say, 2x6s when they should have been using 2x8, for example, given the span. Does that make sense to everybody? All right. As Mike pointed out in the introduction, NADRA is one of the key organizations focused on deck safety. Every May is Deck Safety Month. So we're in the middle of April now. So that's one thing you may begin to see on different websites, news broadcasts, or even manufacturers that are decking products pointing out the need to have deck safety and inspections. All right, let's dive into the deck components. We're going to start with the one that we're most familiar with that actually attaches the deck, in most cases, to the structure. It's not a freestanding deck. It would be attached, and that would be requiring a ledger board. So in order to do that, we understand the construction methods, materials, flashing, and most importantly on the ledger board, the fasteners. So one of the things that I want to help with is just understanding the different pieces. This technical drawing is providing you all the specifications for this particular mounting of the ledger board at for Fairfax County. Many of the local jurisdictions outside of Fairfax County often, quote unquote, mimic Fairfax County because they're one of the most stringent counties in terms of typical deck details. And therefore, you want to pay attention to Fairfax County. And then, as I pointed out earlier, reconcile that to the location that you might be going to in Northern Virginia or Virginia. I'm going to step out here into the front. And then what I want you to see is just the awareness of the layers of the system here that we're looking at. Exterior sheathing, the studs, the band board, the floor joists from within the house, and now we're getting into the fasteners. And they require a 1/2 inch diameter lag screw or 1/4 inch approved wood screws. This is Fairfax County's most recent application. How many times have you walked up and looked at a ledger board and you see it mounted with carriage bolts? That's actually prohibited. There is no testing in any of the code information or the NADRA specifications in terms of decks that has proven carriage bolts are the correct fastener for a ledger board. But they're out there, and it's very frequent. So again, think about how you're looking at the deck, and you look up, you go, oh, there's the fasteners, everything's good, nothing's rusted, I'm moving on. Oh, wait, those were carriage bolts, and they're not supposed to be there. So again, this is why I'm asking and hoping that I'm challenging you to think about it. If you're already doing this, then you are right on target, and you're helping your clients and customers in the best way you can. So what does it mean to have the fasteners installed in a certain pattern or way? Well, this has all been proven through the structural engineering of how that ledger board should be attached. And the county and other testing have proven that you want to install the fasteners in a staggered pattern. And I'll just highlight this for a second. Angle down, up, like that, okay? But look at the requirements. You want a minimum 2 inches from the top. How many times do you look at a ledger board and the bolt is just below, maybe it's 1 inch below the top of that ledger board? So again, this is where you have the opportunity to really help your client because you understand where those minimum standards are. And I know other people throughout the day, our speakers, have said, well, the code is the minimum standard. I agree, it is the minimum standard. But if they're not meeting the minimum standard, then that's a problem. Okay, then here's something new that's, I believe, was on the 2018 for Fairfax County. Their typical deck detail is the requirement for 4 fasteners at the ends of each, the left end and the right end of the ledger board. That is rarely ever done. So again, wanting you to understand the opportunity that you have here to look at this in terms of how to help your customers and give a good inspection. Here's a couple examples of on-site photos that I've taken. This is our wonderful carriage bolt mounting the ledger board. The orange circle on this end here is missing fastener because we wanted that staggered pattern. And then back here, we have a crack in the ledger board at the actual carriage bolt location. So again, if you're going quickly and you have to look up and do X number of cavities, we'll just make up a simple number, 10 or 12 cavities, you could quickly miss that if you're doing this. So again, trying to help in a way that modifies your approach, okay? Next, I wanted to just give one more example of the attachment to the ledger board. And again, this is something to think about in terms of maybe some properties that you're familiar with in Arlington or other areas where they try to mount the ledger board to a brick wall or a concrete wall, and then it's parge coated. So again, wanting to make sure you're recognizing that a different kind of fastener is required at that location with the expansion of the fastener. Okay. Here's an example where they did one of the new aluminum decks. I'm not sure if anyone's seen those. This is actually where they mount it directly into the poured concrete walls. And you can see the fastener right there. So again, while it seems like you're never going to see something into concrete, here's an example. Most of you know right off the bat that there are several prohibited ledger board attachments. The first being on an open web truss system. So what that means is if you had an I-joist that had an I-joist, quote unquote, band board, then you would not be able to anchor that ledger board to that open web floored truss system. The next is if you have brick veneer, and that's in the middle picture right here. So we just highlighted that. And then lastly is in the condition back here where you have a cantilever overhang. In that case, you don't want to attach that deck to the overhang. Any questions on that? Yes, sir.
On a solid masonry foundation,
Mhm.
let's say with cinder block.
Yes.
You come up and you have a ledger board attached to the top row of the brick and block. Is that permitted given that it's the last row?
Again, it would have to tie to our previous picture where they're using the proper fasteners for the masonry block. And in many cases, to your point, Lou, that fastener would have to go through the block it would be a through bolt, and they may also require you to modify that with an epoxy attachment to the fastener.
I have a question for you about the aluminum decking.
Yes, sir.
I was always under the impression aluminum should not be in contact with concrete or masonry products.
In this particular case, this manufacturer has designed a system with appropriate flashing that allows it to be attached to that concrete. So outside of the manufacturer's detail, I don't have a better answer
Right.
for you than that.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It does. I figured they must have done something.
Exactly. Yep.
Right.
Yep. So I appreciate the online questions. My back may be to you, but I want you to participate just like we are here in the room. So thank you for asking the question. Yes, sir.
Back one slide. When you were discussing that, and it shows the open web floor trusses, you were describing TJI trusses.
Yes.
Okay.
Did you want to make a,
TJI is an open web truss.
okay, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying, I'm questioning you on that, because no, you can't use it for that, but if you have, can you do a different kind of band board or something if you have TJIs? It specifically doesn't say manufactured wood trusses, it says open web floor trusses.
Okay, so great point. Thank you, Mark. So in terms of clarifying, if there is a TGI floor joist that they've now constructed a band board out of that same material, then this open web prohibition would apply to that scenario because it is not a solid member that is designed to hold the structural weight of the ledger board. Love the question. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Thank you, Mark. All right. Now, framing at a chimney or bay window, that changes how the ledger board and the joists attach in those particular areas. So what I want you to notice is right here, 3-ply joist sides, and it may be reduced to 2 if the joist span is 8 feet 6 inches. So how many times have you seen a boxed wood frame chimney or a masonry chimney that the deck is built, quote unquote, around at the point of the ledger board, and they have 1 joist or maybe 2 joists? But if you don't know the span or you haven't, quote unquote, checked that, then you could be creating a gap in terms of what the homeowner needs to know about that deck and its condition. Okay. The next piece, whoops, sorry, is this highlight where you need a 2-ply header. 1, 2, that's what that means. It's 2 boards creating the header, and that header is then used to attach the joist that will run from the quote unquote front of the chimney or bay window out to the end of the deck. In this case, most often what I'm seeing is only a 1-ply header, and 9 out of 10 times they are not using joist hangers at that location. So it's a single header with no joist hangers, and they toe nailed the joist in there. That is a weak connection, and you would want to call that out in your report that needs to be modified. The modification is actually, quote unquote, fairly simple to add in the additional framing members and then reattach. Go ahead, Andy.
We're dealing with a chimney of 6 feet maximum spread.
Yes. Yep.
However, I do see certain windows or cantilevers, so
Yeah.
to speak. With the span a little bit longer, something around 8 feet.
Mhm.
And single joist, or it could be double, but what if they do supports from underneath?
That actually changes the structural design at that point, because now they've modified the load bearing capacity or point of load bearing. So in this design, load bearing point is here, and then it's repositioned to here. To your point, if they modified that and then added post underneath the corners of this for a longer spanned bay window, then that would actually change the structural design of that. And in most cases, depending on how they supported it with a notch beam and so forth, that would meet the requirements. But again, for that kind of design, the hope would have been they got a structural engineer to confirm that, and therefore submitted the plans to the county, got the permit and the inspections, and it went down the proper path. But great question. All right, here's our famous aluminum deck again, and it's going around the boxed chimney. What I wanted to point out is the structural integrity of the aluminum's quote unquote boxed joist was such that they could actually use the single header and a double ply. Plus, this was less than the 6 foot max. This is only like 4 feet wide. Why do I know this? Because Arlington County ran it through their review process 3 times to get this deck approved. Because the county had not worked with aluminum deck structure. So I know personally, because I actually have the details from the Arlington County review, that this went through. All right. This is a little hard to visualize because it's actually the left and right side of the same chimney. And you can see how they frame this with right here in the corner, lower corner, no double ply. It's basically a ledger board attached to the rim joist of the house at the stone fireplace. And they did the same over here. So this ledger board right here, and on the left side is attached to the stone by nailing the front board to the side board. Yep. It's sitting on the stone. And you wouldn't believe it because this was probably 12 or 13 feet high at this location. And that dropped down to be probably a 40 to 50 foot ravine right below it. It was out on a mountain property. All right, ledger board issues. Andy had the question just a moment ago. This is the cantilever. They attach the deck to this short cantilever. It's, give or take a foot or so. Another issue is where you can see the ledger board actually pulling off the wall. And this is, again, right with a brick veneer at the bottom. So what I wanted you to also recognize is if you're doing new construction, a lot of the builders nowadays, to save money but give detail, are only putting quote unquote water table brick around the house. So what that means is they're coming around the front of the house, maybe 2 or 3 feet up to, let's say if it had a porch, that height, but down the side, they're going basically just above grade and then around the back, but that makes it look more expensive. And what you're getting is brick veneer right about where they're gonna mount the ledger board. But the builder's running that brick up to the bottom of the door seal at the back door. So I don't have a picture of that, but again, being on a property recently, there was no room because they had a brick cap on top of that brick underneath the door, such that if you put the ledger there, it would not line up flush. And you'd have to figure out how to work with the brick cap as well as the brick veneer on that rear of the house. Okay, some quick items for you just to call out real quick as you're walking and looking at the deck. We'll start at the 11 o'clock position. Whoops. Yep. Corrosion and rust on the fasteners. This is actually one of NADRA's biggest items to focus on. If there's rust on fasteners to the point that it's actually running down the wood, that's a problem. In terms of you don't know how bad that rusted fastener is, and it's recommended it be removed and replaced, and also assess any potential damages. Moving to the 1 o'clock position, cracks or decay. You can see the orange line right there. Next on the 7 o'clock position is the missing fasteners. And then lastly, no flashing. Many decks do not have flashing, and I will get to pictures that will show you how important that is. And we're going to do it right now. So ledger board flashing, I want to make sure everyone is aware of what should be there. You should have back flashing, and then there's actual flashing, and then you're going to have a metal type flashing, and then you have your joist. There are manufacturers right now that are also coming out with a rubber membrane that goes on top of the ledger board as well as out onto the joist to protect the joist and ledger board structures. The bottom photos are pictures of that detail actually being installed, and I believe the source was Fine Home Building. And for me personally, as a deck inspector, this is what I would want to see. So if you can look at the mechanics of what you're seeing in the pictures, you can see in the middle picture, I'll just slow down here. Here's the middle, right here. You can see the back flashing, and then you can see the upper flashing that they're going to wrap the ledger board with. If we move to this picture, you can see the metal flashing has now been added. And then if we come back over here, now they're taping the top of the ledger board. This is, for me personally, like loving construction, this is the ideal setup for a ledger board flashing. But I have only seen this in the field one time, and I'll show you the next picture. This almost exactly what we just looked at in detail. This was by a builder out in West Virginia. And I'm telling you, it is the only deck in new construction that I've actually seen them do this. So go ahead.
When the builder's gonna put the deck on. But if they're just putting a ledger on, then it's not done.
No, but you raise a good point, because this particular house, they did not buy the deck, but I guess they bought some option where the ledger board would be attached, and it actually was finished construction just as you're seeing it. But look, they have the 4 bolts on the end, staggered bolts, all the flashing that we just looked about with a backer. I mean, this is like picture perfect, but it's not here in Northern Virginia. Yes, sir. It was. No.
The Miranda development?
Is that Richmond American?
No, okay, Richmond American?
Yeah.
I know which one you're talking about.
Yep.
Guys, we're getting sloppy on the microphones again.
Okay.
I
Was
realize
there a
it's late in the
question?
day.
Okay. All right. We're going to keep cruising. All right. This is another example of what I call really good construction in terms of flashing, tying in. This is cantilever. So that's a cantilever design. And I want you to really pay attention to what's going on here. They wrapped each cantilever joist. Then they had, look at the back flashing. Layer 1 is right here. And then they put the next layer overlapping it and got it all sealed. Now, I would question, quote unquote, the staples without the tape over the staples. So if you know the zip system, this should have been something that the builder thought through in terms of covering that with the tape. Yes, sir.
About taping the joints and everything and coming back and fixing with the zip system.
Yeah.
The taping over all the fasteners is recommended optional
Okay.
in their manufacturer's detail.
Okay. Good to know.
I have a
Right.
question.
Yes, sir.
Does it give you concern that the wood's embedded in a masonry product or a stone product?
Based on where the flashing is right there, quote unquote, I would have liked to have seen it come out to the edge where my arrow is. It looks like it's a little short. This one's definitely shorter. So to your point, yes, I have a little question about that. And I believe in my report, I did call out that the masonry joints needed to be confirmed in terms of they were flashed and protected from the actual wood.
All right.
Does that answer your question?
It does. Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. All right. If you walk away with nothing from my presentation, I want you to understand the following pictures. This was a house in Great Falls with cantilever joists for a balcony. And this is what it looks like when you do not put in the flashing. It rotted everything around it. But look, the pressure treated wood, which is designed to withstand some rot and deterioration,
It was okay.
held up better
Right.
than everything else. Why? Because that was pressure treated. But look again. That's the top plate. That's the framing and header over the door. There's the king and jack stud next to the door. You got it, all interior wood. For all my years in doing this, I've never got to see what actually it looks like for that bad of a deterioration. We've seen some pictures of kick out flashing on a roof and how it tears up the wall. But in terms of a balcony or deck, I've never seen anything rot other than our pictures of the collapse. But for this not to be a collapse and to be deteriorated in this way was just like, wow, I found the coolest picture. And this is from a job I did.
Ooh.
This is the detail that I wanted you to see
Yeah.
around that pressure treated wood. You can see it got really black, but it's not deteriorated like all the other wood I was just describing. And then, you know, let's add some fun to it. All that was in water saturated, deteriorated wood, and there's your electrical wiring running down through that wall.
What's that? Oh my goodness.
So again, trying to emphasize the point of the flashing. If you don't get it and you don't point it out, that's not what we want to give to our customers. This was 22 years old. The house was a mess. I'm going to be very honest with you. But to get to see this, like I said, I was so excited. Okay, here's the next point is on footings. I'm going to keep us on time here. I want you to see this comment right here, the blue. Sometimes decks are built freestanding and they put in the post and the footers, excuse me, up against the house. If it is a walkout basement, quote unquote, that will probably work as long as they're going through the county to get the permits and they actually dug down below the house footer on the walkout basement. So that's a lot of detail. However, if that is not a walkout basement and they put the deck post within that 5 feet of space, then that is disturbed ground because they dug that out as part of the foundation and that was backfilled up against the foundation and therefore was not potentially stable. And again, that's why you want the county to come in and inspect your footers on this type of installation. Okay, just a couple details. When you're doing new construction, they will pour the footers when the cement truck is there, pouring the concrete walls likely for a deck or balcony. A lot of the newer houses have the boxed in screen in porch where they'll do that. My point is, it says right here, installed after concrete has been cured, requires a minimum of 2 inches of side cover. So basically they're saying if you're using a fastener and you poured a pad for that fastener to be anchored into, you should have a 2-inch surround. And the other would be, you would also want to see that post, quote unquote, centered or as close as it can. If you're doing new construction, a lot of time you're going to walk up, it'll be completely on the one edge. Yep. And you have the opportunity to let the builder know. The only way the builder is going to fix that is to dig that
Yeah,
footer
right.
wider and then add to it as a supplementary footer because they're not going to move the post. So I just wanted you to have that as a reference point that it should be centered and you want that clearance around it if it does have the metal bracket. The other green box I wanted to highlight for you is basically at the 12 o'clock position. What they're suggesting is if you're using a precast post connector, you want to have at least a minimum gap between that and your concrete for airflow. And again, as you're walking through, and if you have that kind of connector on the post, this could be something very easy. You just walk by and don't check for that gap and the potential to have the right airflow under there. So these drawings are typically in your typical detail from your counties. So you can go reconcile this for wherever you're working. All right, here's our metal deck again. You can see they did a good job centering that post. And you can see, you know, as a guess, it has at least 2-inch surround on that. So that was done in a quote unquote well-designed manner. All right, just a couple pictures of deteriorated post. I actually have a metal tool that is used for auto body, and it's about 14 inches long. It has a nice curled into it, and you can just take it and hook it on your finger and shove up alongside the deck post. And I'll be surprised, I'm many times surprised how many times that post goes that pole goes flying in underneath the post because it's rotted. And again, I'm not destroying anything, but I have that because I'm on a deck safety inspection. So I'm physically driving that down alongside the post, and that's the type of destruction I've seen. All right, now let's go to our beams. There are many beams that I've come across that are spliced, given the size or length of the deck, and they're not splicing it over a post. Or they will trick you and have a solid piece on the front, but the second ply is a splice and they do it just randomly wherever the board length ran out. That's incorrect. Both plies at a splice need to be sitting on that quote unquote post, or in this case, a drop beam post. The other is there's an actual nailing pattern required for a beam. And in many cases, you'll get 2 or 3 nails, but that's not what's typically needed based on the width of that beam. So again, you have to kind of reconcile the width of the beam with the fastener requirements for that beam size. Okay, I got like 3 minutes, so I'm going to move along quickly. Here's our cantilever joist that we looked at earlier. You can see at this end, the beam with the notched post, the 2-ply beam, and then it's going across every area had a post underneath of it. This is also something that is rarely there. When the joist comes across the top of the beam, it is toe nailed. Per Fairfax County, you should have hurricane clips. So what I'm suggesting is you pay attention to that detail, because 9 out of 10 deck builders are only using toe nailed connections. They're not adding the hurricane clips. This is one of my funnest decks I got to look at. You can see starting in the 11 o'clock position, those are the joists at the beam. You can see the fasteners, and probably it was about a 3/4 inch gap. Over here, you can clearly see the gap. Coming down here, they put blocks in with shims on top of the block, and they were trying to level the deck. So you just wonder what the builder was thinking in terms of that deck and how they got that so messed up. Yes. Okay, post to beam connection, and you just called it out. You cannot mount the ply of your beam to the front side or the rear side of the post. That's prohibited. So if you walk up to a deck and see that, you got to write it up. Here's a perfect example of what that looks like. And there's your favorite carriage bolts. This is a steel column that has deteriorated. I mean, the wood beam above has deteriorated. So what did they do? They got the brackets that go with the steel column and just nailed those into the cracked and deteriorated beam. And that's going to hold everything together, but we have joists that are all cracked. And that's what it was holding up. Okay, we're going to run out of time, so I want to get to, I think, one more slide here. So there is lateral bracing that's required based on the span of the deck that you'll want to comply with, and make sure you understand what method is applied for that span and joist size, such that you get the proper lateral support. In some cases, you can do the installation of tension ties at the ledger board, and you would do 1 on each end plus 2 towards the middle of that deck structure. However, depending on, again, what conditions that deck is being built with, you may have to have modified lateral support. which could be bracing at the post, and that bracing might be made out of 2x material, or at the 5 o'clock position picture, you'll see that's actually 6x6. And most of the time, if you're looking at any bracing like that, all they did was use the 2x4 material. Rarely will you see the 6x6. All right, I think we're going to be wrapping it up here. This is I wanted to show you this. This is a temperature test on decking material, and to show you how hot it gets during a summer day. The test was done in Georgia. The temperature was 85 degrees. The aluminum decking was the coolest decking versus pressure treated at 123 degrees Fahrenheit, composite, which we're very familiar with, at 133. And then the PVC composite was actually the highest at 138. And most of us would have thought the aluminum decking would have like burned your feet right off, but their test proved not to be the case. All right. Also, if the decking is using composite decking and they're having hidden fasteners where there's no fasteners in that decking, which is typical, it should have horizontal bracing underneath of it. And it may also require special spacing or additional blocking to support the hidden fasteners. Okay, I think I'm going to have to stop. We're down to, all right. I'm going to show you one last thing. Final comment. If you have notched stair stringers and that span of the stair stringer is greater than 6'9" it requires a separate post and beam structure to support it. There are many decks that are built with one run that's like 13 or 14 feet long with no middle support. So please pay attention to this. And that's my final item for the presentation. We are at our 5-minute mark for the evening.